in relation to the work that he has undertaken. He has produced for the report several reports over the last 5 years, and we thought it would be good to take a look back and take stock. We think that it is an encouraging picture, and hopefully you will too. So can I hand over to John to give us an overview of his report, and then the Vice Chair, Brendan Mullen's going to compare the Q&A session. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Sinead. We think that the human rights approach to policing in Northern Ireland has helped the police themselves to do the best possible job, but also is a important part of policing the people and the people who have those rights. And I think, and I've spoken to police officers about this, it's also provided an important compass to assist officers themselves in navigating their way through difficult decisions that they have to make every day, sometimes very difficult decisions. However, there is still a way to go. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that in terms of whether the PSNI is truly compliant every day in every way. And more of those issues are set out in the full report, which I'll talk about in a second. So this 5-year review sets out the Policing Board's assessment of the compliance with the Human Rights Act, and the findings were encouraging. Progress has been made in many areas, such as responding to domestic violence and abuse cases, supporting vulnerable victims, and the training and awareness for officers on human rights issues. The PSNI have also taken much more robust action when dealing with its own officers and staff who have violated the law or PSNI's own code of ethics. So just a note about what's happening today. You will have picked up the 47 pages 5-year human rights review summary. However, that's just a taster, that's the hors d'oeuvre. There's also something called the Human Rights 5-year review report, only 269 pages. And then if that's not enough for you, there is also a table of all of the human rights recommendations we made from 2015, before I started, to 2023, and the PSNI's responses to those recommendations, and that's only 160 pages. And then in parallel with this, but published by the PSNI, is something we worked on together with the PSNI, a human rights awareness summary, which I'm not exactly sure what time that's going to be published, but that's going to be published in parallel. So just some brief issues about what we picked up. There were 18 recommendations in the reports. The first one, which is concerns about the PSNI's own approach to human rights. So we know that senior officers and their lawyers, and some of their lawyers are in the audience, but I won't name them, have a lot of detailed understanding and knowledge about how you put human rights in practice, as I say, on a day-to-day basis. And some of those are set out in service instructions and policies. But when I first started in this role 5 years ago, I was a bit surprised that there was a kind of expectation in the public sphere that the people who are expert on human rights were actually in the Policing Board rather than the PSNI. And I've been trying to encourage them to take ownership of human rights, and that means including information and details about how you do human rights in practice in all of the service instructions and policies. And I'm glad to say some of that is now beginning to happen. So I'm hoping that in the future we'll see more advice to police officers in a practical sense about how to do their job alongside complying with human rights. We made it a priority in this review to consider the human rights of victims of crime, because sometimes there seems to be some assumption that human rights belongs to suspects and defendants. But and the first 6 recommendations concern the PSNI's duty to protect victims. And we've raised questions, as the Performance Committee does, about repeat victims. We victims of domestic violence and vulnerable victims. Of course, there is some information about stop and search, particularly the low, quote, success rate of the exceptional controversial Justice and Security Act powers, but also some positive news because the PSNI has developed a project to start to identify the community background of those people stopped and searched. Many of you in this audience will have seen some other work we've done on custody in relation to strip searching children and young people, and that report is one of the reports that is referenced in the recommendations. And it's also to see that some of the priorities in relation to protecting people from hate crime is moving on, and PSNI are taking that more seriously. And that's, I'm sure there's more to do, but that's something that we would commend. There are, of course, issues about the use of force, and some of those issues are controversial, both more generally, the devices and weapons, but also in relation to children and young people. But of course, we shouldn't forget that police officers also have human rights, and you'll see that there's references to the report that we wrote about on police officers and their human rights, and most of those recommendations have been agreed by PSNI. Just quickly, 2 or 3 other things. There's much more to say about covert surveillance. I can talk for a long time about this, so I'm hoping there's a series of at least 200 questions coming my way. Just to note, though, this report was in practice finished at the end of March, so it doesn't talk much about the cases that are pending, but you will have seen that the PSNI produced 2 reports for us. The second one much more detailed than the first, and of course there's now a review by Angus McCulloch of the whole thing about surveillance and lawyers, journalists and other people. I suppose if there was a question I'd like people to think about going forward, and this is where I'll finish, it would be, well, does any of this stuff make any difference? And what kind of reports should we do? And just a comparison, those people who've read anything that we've written might see some differences between, say, the detailed and short report on strip searching of children and people in custody compared with the longer, more perhaps theoretical issues about privacy and policing, about not just about covert surveillance, but about CCTV and facial recognition. What works best? What should the board focus on? Unfortunately, the board has extended my contract, so you're stuck with me for another year. But one day there will be somebody new, and we'll need to start thinking about what they might want to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, for that introduction to the report and to today's discussion. We're now entering the Q&A phase of the launch, so it's very much over to you. We're going to structure it along the themes within the report. 8 themes: victims of crime, stop and search, arrest and custody, public order, use of force, legacy, privacy, and levers of change. So that's 8 sections. We've got an hour, so that's about 9 minutes per section. Now, I suspect some of them will be of more interest and importance than others, and we'll respond to that as we go along. Some rules. The first is that you have to have a microphone to speak. I think I'm right in that, and their staff will have them, yeah, because we have got people joining us online. The second point would be that unless you're uncomfortable to do so, if you could say who you are and what organisation you're from before you ask your question, that would be good. And the final rule is that in terms of inviting people to ask a question, I'll start with those that haven't asked a question previously before moving on to giving another opportunity to those that have already asked a question. So our first theme then is victims of crime. Now, victims have the right to be treated with compassion and respect, and to be taken seriously and to feel their offence is being considered properly. So really, how a victim is treated actually underpins the integrity of the whole criminal justice system. And in that context, what would our first question be in relation to the HR report? If I could maybe kick it off then, and oh, is there? Sorry, I missed that. Yes, thank you. Just shout out if I don't see you.
Sorry, I was quickly trying to read the report there to see what I might ask. Skimming quickly through. Sorry, my name's Geraldine Hanna. I'm the Commissioner Designate for Victims of Crime, so I probably should ask you something about it. And I'm looking through it. Obviously, there's been significant changes in legislation with regards to domestic and sexual abuse and the offences coming through, and I see the report acknowledging that. I'm interested in, obviously legislation is needed, it's an important tool in tackling such an issue as domestic and sexual abuse, but I'm wondering, from the board's perspective, are they seeing benefits of the new legislation or any challenges and anything that's maybe missed? And I'm not sure if necessarily all of you are able to answer that. I'm trying to wonder whether I'm posing it to John or to Ryan in that respect, but just to kick it off.
Thanks. Liz, we'll give you the opportunity to respond to that.
Thanks, Geraldine. Well, first thing to say is that 1 in 4 recorded crimes are now effectively domestic violence, domestic abuse, or around the new series of offences that have happened. So it's a really significant issue in terms of the volume of crime that's recorded. The report suggests, and the sense that we get from the board, is that PSNI are taking it seriously in terms of how they are training staff, making sure that they actually deal with the issues in a sensitive way that's empathic. There are still some issues around, some that you're familiar with. The minority ethnic communities and reporting. There used to be a kind of routine reporting to the Home Office that went way beyond National Policing Council guidelines. That's temporary, it's been abated, and there's work that you, ourselves, and PSNI are doing, which I think is quite productive, and I would like to get over the line before the end of the year. So from a board perspective, I think our sense on this issue is that police are taking it seriously. There is an issue for PSNI about resources. There are discussions about how much and what they can do, the loss of neighbourhood policing, the numbers of neighbourhood police and neighbourhood policing teams. And at the moment, the tension for PSNI is how do you effectively maintain all of these services with fewer and fewer people, and will that have kind of an impact? And my final thing to say, which is I suppose is a slight shot across PSNI's bows in the sense of we also get quite a lot of information about how victims of crime feel, both in terms of those in general about whether people feel safe, and then those who've actually been the victim of a crime. And if you look at the figures for those who are about generally do people feel safe, that scores very highly. It's on a slight inexorable decline over the last 3 or 4 years, but still scores very highly compared to, and our comparators are nearly always UK forces, because the way stats are kept. If you look then at the figures of those who've been the victims of crime and how well, and this is beyond domestic abuse, then scores much less highly. Still not too bad, but significantly lower. So there's a kind of an issue about when you actually experience a crime and how well you're kept informed and how well you're dealt with, doesn't score as well as do people feel generally safe and confident in contacting the police if they were a victim of crime. So I think there's a pretty good story to tell for PSNI, but still some work to do.
Thanks, Liz. Ryan, I'm conscious that it's all very well bringing in new legislation, and in fact, quite recently there's been further legislation brought in this whole area. But if the resources aren't put in place, then it becomes difficult to then apply that legislation in practice. How does the PSNI respond to that challenge and meet to best of its abilities the constant pipeline of further laws that it has to enforce?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important thing to bring out in terms of the impact of new legislation. So I think the first thing to say is I think the body of legislation that we have brought forward in Northern Ireland over recent years, particularly in relation to violence against women and girls and domestic abuse, has been incredibly strong and incredibly important. It says a lot about what we as a society in Northern Ireland put at the forefront of our agenda. So that having it in legislation for me has been a step change, and clearly for the PSNI has opened new avenues around non-fatal strangulation, coercive control, etc., in terms of prosecutions around those. So I think that's been really, really positive. Brendan, the point around new legislation coming in is that we have to do it incredibly collaboratively to understand the actual impact of that, and then resource it together collaboratively to allow us to be able to make the most of it. I think there would be nothing more frustrating as a victim to see legislation in place, but that there's not the resourcing there to be able to deal with that legislation as they would like it to be done. And that is, actively ongoing, those conversations around what the new legislation might mean, what it might mean in terms of training, what it might mean in terms of the actual legal process to follow around others, not just domestic abuse. So I think it's a really important part of it, and really important we all understand clearly the impact of it. But it's not just about legislation. You, Brenda, wrote it down, talked about compassion and respect. I'm really proud to have the role of victims champion within PSNI. It's a fantastic and sort of privileged role to have, because what is policing if we're not for victims, and we are not the principal advocates for victims within the system? And I think we have been and can do a lot in terms of the victim experience. So I think one element of it is, how effective is it in terms of the outcomes? Because that has an impact on confidence from those wanting to bring forward crimes, and PSNI compare very well nationally in terms of the outcome rate, sitting at around 32% compared to other services. Violence against the persons right 24% against around 9% in England and Wales, and that is good, and it's good we get a chance to talk about that. I think we all know, and there's a growing body of academic work would support the fact that it's not just the outcome, it's the experience. And we will all know that the criminal justice system, as we move through it, it's not transparent. Victims feel often like the flotsam and jetsam as they're taken through the tide of the justice process, and actually be given the opportunity to put their hands on the tiller and have more of a voice in that experience. Then you drive confidence and satisfaction, and you drive the victim experience for the better. So for me, that is really a really important bit of work for us in PSNI, and I think as the the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy has evolved, as the work that we're doing in terms of vulnerable victims, you start to see that come through, and we're helped in that. So Jerry's in the room, but she's just one of a whole range of victim voices through support groups, advocacy groups, and others who we trust and who challenge us in terms of that work that we're doing to kind of keep us on course around that. We invested heavily in the Victim and Witness Care Unit that's co-located with the Public Prosecution Service to keep victims updated as they go through the criminal justice process. And actually, if you to Google now, report crime, there's just a much better way for people to report crime online through the work that we're doing through our Digital Citizens Board, which is allowing people to have much more control over the process. So they're a part of it, they're a partner in it, and it's not done to them, it's done with them. Very soon we'll be launching the ability for people to be able to contact officers directly to get information, simple information, such as their crime reference number or other things that they may have to ring up to, just to make the victim journey simpler, so they're not having to make as much effort, so that they feel informed, that they feel in charge of the process. So none of those things need legislation. All of those things just need good leadership, good thought. But as part of a broader justice system, I am involved with the Criminal Justice Board, and I chair with colleagues in the PPS the Working Together group to try and speed up and make the justice process more effective and much more victim focused. Because often, and Les talked about some of the surveys, actually it's the justice system that is seen to be the thing that victims find it hard when they become a part of it. And my job and those that I work with through the justice sector is to make that better. And so for me, that is going to be a significant focus of the PSNI's work over the next 12 months to make sure that actually we're seen as world leading in terms of how we look after victims.
Thanks, Ryan. Unless there's there is another pressing question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Claire McCann and I'm from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. And this is a great report. I'm really looking forward to reading all 100 plus, 200 plus pages of it, because I'm that kind of person. My question is slightly tangential to what we're talking about here today. I work in the Rights After Brexit work stream in the Commission, and one of the things that we're really conscious of is that there's a new framework for how we think about victims within that. And I was wondering, to what extent have the Policing Board or the police considered that within their work, or is that an active area that you're considering at the moment?
Sinead, would you like to take that?
I'd like John to take it as our human rights advisor.
Wonderful pass. Thank you.
Easier for me to, I'll tell you why it might be easier for me to answer it, because I was involved in the Commission when it came to negotiating that little bit of what's now the Windsor framework. And it's fair to say, at least from the Policing Board perspective, no, we haven't spent time looking at the Windsor framework, and it's probably worth saying for those who either have forgotten or deliberately wiped from their memory the impact of Brexit. Essentially, what that bit of the Windsor framework does is preserve European law and various bits of, including a victims directive for Northern Ireland only, and therefore we still have some EU tools in the locker for Northern Ireland that you won't necessarily have, and any development of victims directives and EU law, Northern Ireland will keep pace with that. So I must confess, even I, who was involved in all of that, haven't kind of raised it. So if I'm not raising it, you can probably guess that there's nobody else in the Policing Board raising it. So it's one for us to take away and have a think about, but it's not come across our radar. Be surprised if it's high on the list of PSNIs, but Ryan may be able to answer that.
Before he does, can we meet tomorrow?
Thanks, John. No, likewise, it hasn't been at the forefront of our developments around this, so again, keen to understand where that might help the work. So thank you.
I'm going to move on to the next section. Otherwise, I'll have completely failed on the first one in terms of keeping to time. I am noticing a tactic by the panel, though, and that is to give extremely long answers to the questions so that they don't get another question. So I think we'll try and keep the answers shorter and maybe get an extra question in. That takes us on to stop and search. And I think that is potentially the area that has greatest potential to alienate a community. With regard to stop and search, police must comply with Article 8, which is respect of privacy, and Article 14, be non-discriminatory. And also, in relation to PACE, the power should be used legally and proportionately. So in that context, have the first question.
Thank you. Patrick Horrigan from Amnesty International. I'll maybe help you here by dealing with not just stop and search, but some other linked issues. And it's the...
That's called cheating.
I'm trying to be helpful. I think the report notes and previous research has noted the disproportionate use of stop and search on members from the Catholic community compared to members of the Protestant community, on members from minoritized communities, and particularly Irish travellers, against whom the powers were used very disproportionately based on the statistics. We see a similar pattern in terms of arrests, with twice the rate of arrest of members from the Catholic community compared to members of the Protestant community, and also charges after arrest. And we also see a similar pattern in terms of, for instance, use of force. If we look at the statistics previously published on the use of spit hoods, again, for those who gave their background identity, not everybody did, but for those who did, again, you were twice as likely to have a spit hood used on you if you were Catholic than if you were Protestant. So it's about disproportionate use of police powers, from stop and search to use of force to arrest, on Catholics versus Protestants, and members from minoritized communities versus the majority white community. And I suppose it's a question, obviously, to the police, but also to the policing board, because this seems to be a very significant and worrying trend across many rights issues and across many powers which the police have.
Thanks, Patrick. Ryan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks very much, Patrick. And I mean, it's a really live question and has been for some time. I think the work that's being done around trying to help understand community background in a more sophisticated way is going to be really helpful in this. I think it's so important that from a policing perspective that we are seen to be really open to understanding the issue. For me, this is about understand. And then if there is disproportionality evidence, then why is that the case? How do you reform? How do you change? Or if there's not, then how do you provide that information to explain that? There are, as you will know, a whole range of accountability mechanisms internally within policing to check and to audit and to understand why searches are happening and when they are happening. As you'll know, with certain use of powers, particularly Justice and Security Act powers, there's very senior level authorisation for those, Assistant Chief Constable level, and then also elsewhere within government. But the question understandably remains, and part of that question has been, I think, collectively we haven't been able to give the data in a way that allows greater understanding of why and where and how and when they're being used. Globally, stop and search is clearly a critical issue for policing around community confidence. Is a rubbing point for some communities where it's felt to be disproportionately exercised. So for me, as a leader in the police, we kind of need to be absolutely all over that to be showing that we are not deaf to those questions, because they're absolutely appropriate questions to ask. And I hope the work with the board allows us to shine a light on that, so collectively we can understand it better together.
Thanks, Ryan. John or Leanne, would you like to respond just in terms of some of the work, particularly recently, that the board is doing to?
Yeah, no, I mean, the issue that you've raised, Patrick, is one of the frustrating ones, I think. There's a guy, you've probably never heard of him, called Keir Starmer. Anyway, in about 2005, he wrote a report saying the PSNI should investigate the community background issues in relation to stop and search. So where are we now? 19 years on. And there is, however, good news, as I said, a pilot project. It's not good enough. The police, I'm afraid to say, have given me in the 5 years about 20 different reasons why they couldn't do this. I never believed any of them, including that it wasn't lawful, even though, and it took the Secretary of State to tell them that it was, and in fact was in the code of practice, at least in relation to the JSA. And I'm afraid, I don't want to criticise the PSNI too much, but there seems to be a failure to understand about disproportionality and equality law. And so often the discussions that I've had, and I know Marie Breen-Smith before me and others, the allegation isn't that police officers try to find Catholics and arrest them and stop and search them. The allegation is a much more sophisticated one, which is the disproportionality that currently exists and needs to be explored is about indirect discrimination, and it may be for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily because of institutional problems within the PSNI. It may be the relationship between some communities and other communities in relation to policing. And that has been a barrier, and I think maybe it's beginning to fall away. So I think there is good work being done, but as I say, you know, for 19 years it's been a problem, and maybe even before that, and certainly for the 5 years I've done it, and I don't understand why that is. And there's an institutional blockage, despite the fact that perhaps that blockage is beginning to fall apart. And I think I said this time last year when I was releasing my last report.
Just briefly, I think there's two issues. The first is how efficient is stop and search? So putting aside for a second community background, disproportionate use on travellers, on ethnic minority communities, and certainly with the Justice and Security Act, the answer is it appears to be very inefficient, because in terms of actually ever achieving anything in terms of an outcome, the proportion is tiny. It's been like pulling teeth, and I know because I was involved at the other side of the table to try and move this on, but it's worth saying that the pilot is one that is only Justice and Security Act, but hopefully that's a starting point. And then the third point to make, and it's fair to say that this is one of the areas where you have both a political narrative and an empirical narrative within the board. The reality is there are more than one view of what two-tier policing is, including arguments that that's disproportionately unfair to Protestant community as well as disproportionately unfair to Catholic community. And those are narratives that, and they're wider than just the policing board, alongside an empirical narrative, which is what do the stats tell us? And in as much as the ones that we can get, it does suggest that you're much more likely to be arrested, you're stopped, arrested, have a spit and bite guard applied to you. But it's very difficult to see how disproportionately you apply spit and bite guards to Catholics over Protestants, given the kind of circumstances. So interrogating the reasons behind some of that empirical data is much more difficult. So I think we're starting to move in the right direction, but it's been a long and slow process.
We have a question online in relation to stop and search, and it's in relation to the application of stop and search to the Irish traveller community. So in terms of recommendation 8 in the report, and John, you'll know this off by heart, but I assume it's the deep dive into the statistics around the application of stop and search to the traveller community. Is there a timeline to publish this report?
I have access to you know, some of the internal material that the PSNI produce, and I think all they must be commended for looking at this issue, and because it is a surprise that the Justice and Security Act, which is generally speaking targeted in relation to national security and terrorism, not completely, is being used in relation to to Irish travellers. But this is something that has been the subject of some investigation, and the recommendation really is about the publication of that, because I think it's important that PSNI is open about what the circumstances are, what the facts are, so perhaps other organisations can begin to interrogate that, and we can move on from that process. That's the idea of the transparency. And I hope that can happen quickly.
Ryan, I know there has already been a lot of work done on it, and certainly the board, through its performance committee, has seen the initial findings, but some more work to be done. Would it be the intention to publish that, or is that for your own internal learning and review?
Brent, I'm not involved in that bit of work personally, so I may have to come back to you on that, but I imagine that is the plan, but I'll need to come back. Thank you.
Is there any other questions on stop and search? Yes.
Thank you to the panel and for the report. My name is John Topping from Queen's University Belfast. I suppose it's a more general commentary deriving from this report, and perhaps which is symptomatic of a longer picture around stop and search, perhaps 10, 15 years as well. At the minute, PSNI's arrest rate for every single one of their districts in terms of stop and search is lower than the average of England and Wales. In fact, the arrest rate for PSNI is the lowest in the UK at the minute. As identified in this report, in 4 out of every 5 stop and searches, the outcome doesn't match the original object of the stop and search in the first instance. And we also have a position where the arrest rate for children, i.e. under 18s, which is mostly done under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, sits at around 3%, which is arguably a little better than random chance. So is there an issue with the flexibility and therefore the standards, the human rights standards, with which this form of police power is being applied to children in Northern Ireland? And what can we do to fix that?
Ryan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, stop and search is rightly can be a key issue, not just for communities, but for anyone really with an interest in the use of police powers, but of course for us as the police as well. I mean, the nature of the broadly stop and search legislation, with the exception of the Justice and Security Act, in terms of the grounds for it, is that kind of reasonable suspicion that somebody may have an article or a drug. And that's to allay the officers to whether they have that or not. So we tend to go to, in terms of the effectiveness, the arrest rates around that. Of course, that is a kind of proxy for it. There probably are other measures that one could choose to look at in relation to the effectiveness of that, particularly in areas of high crime, where you may see some reduction in crime within that area. But I do think it's something that we absolutely need to be alive to. We are getting a whole new batch of new officers through the door over the coming months in policing. Their initial training focuses upon the grounds on which they would be using those powers. As I say, we have a whole regime of trying to understand it. But I think the more eyes and more ears and voices kind of looking at this, scrutinising this, helping develop the evidence base around those key issues, particularly young people. We're all in this room so acutely aware about the impact of trauma on young people, and it's kind of traumatic if you're being searched by a police officer when you're a young person. So we want to really understand, if there are issues, what those are, and how, in terms of our training and our practice and our governance, that we lean into those. So yeah, I think it's a really valid point, and one I think we're totally alert to, and there's plenty around the room to help us with that work.
Thanks. I'm going to move on. I apologise, but we've a lot to go through, and we're going to move on to arrest and custody. So in terms of arrest and custody, there's an immediate conflict with Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to liberty. And then when in custody, Article 3, prohibition of ill treatment, and generally Article 14, not to be discriminated against. And then there are, of course, the protection framework through inspections from the Criminal Justice Inspectorate, inspections by RQIA, and the work of the board's own independent custody visitors. So in relation to arrest and custody, who would like to have the first question?
Thanks. I'm Fergal McFerrin from the Children's Law Centre, and I'd like to just comment on the strip searching and custody issue of children and young people, because it's kind of threaded through certainly the summary report as one of the more positive things in terms of the outcome of that work. And I'm perhaps, maybe cynical is too strong, but a little bit cynical that it's not necessarily because it was a shorter, more focused piece of work. It was because it exposed such a blatant disregard to the process that should have been complied with in the first place. And it's a comment, but it is a question about, because certainly there's been progress, there's been an awful lot of effort and work gone into changing what should have already been in place. But I would express continued concern, I think, about whether the true scale of the practice is actually known, and whether the board can continue to keep this as an issue that they look at. And that's an ask, I suppose, of Les, of John, of the board to respond to. And I guess a question to Ryan specifically about whether you are fully confident that every search that takes place in custody and outside of custody that would fall within the scope of the definition of a strip search is actually recorded as such and scrutinised in the way that the new process that now exists says it should be. Thanks.
Sinead, could I ask you in the first instance, just in terms of where this sits currently on the board's agenda?
So I think it's a fair question. Fergal, obviously, as Les and John know, through our performance committee, there's a range of competing pieces of work that are brought forward by members, and in response to our engagement with organisations like yourselves and others represented in the room, there's certainly no intention to take it off the table. But I think the resources that we have to apply to this issue, as with all the other strands of our human rights work, there's always going to be a bit of a balance. But there's certainly no intention to take it off the table. And we, John has mentioned he'll be with us until July, and I've no doubt he'll keep his focus on it. And then we will have a new human rights advisor. And I think part of our the trick over the couple of months before John leaves will be to make sure that we've got those high priority issues that we know have a big impact on public confidence in policing, to make sure that those are up the agenda for the tenure of the future advisor. So, but John and Les may wish to comment more deeply.
So, John, I'm not going to let you to come in. So, it's still, you know, the answer, it's still on the board's agenda, really. Ryan, the suggestion that all strip searches aren't actually recorded, or may not be.
Yeah, thanks, sir. And just to reassure, it's top of my agenda as well, so it sits under my kind of watch in terms of how we've developed the work around that. I mean, probably there's been three bits to it. One's the technology. So you'll recall when we were first discussing this, actually from the PSNI's perspective, we found it very hard to give good data around this really important issue, which was a miss on our part. So we worked hard to make sure the technology means that in terms of how these are how things are recorded, you can't progress unless they are recorded. So our knowledge of them, our recording of it, is in a much better place than it was. We've done significant training with our staff within our custody suites in terms of particularly around the use of the appropriate adult and making sure that that is absolutely done before even thinking about moving to a strip search, and that has seen the numbers drop off really significantly. And then third element is the accountability bit. So the accountability panel, so that now have access to and scrutiny of these, I think has been really helpful development as well, and the numbers are at a level that then allow that to happen. So it's top of our agenda, and I am absolutely sure that within custody, because of all of the above, and outside of the suites, that we are capturing all of those that are happening. But please, 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 if you feel that we're not, or you're getting evidence that we're not, or you're seeing other ways to suggest that we aren't, I need to know. But I don't think we are from all of that work that we've done.
Thanks. Another question on arrest and custody? No? Okay, well, if we move on then to public order. And within public order, you of course have the challenge of balancing conflicting rights. Article 9, freedom of expression. Article 11, freedom of peaceful assembly. Article 8, the right to respect. And then when disorder may actually happen, you've got Article 2, the right to life, or Article 3, not to be subjected to degrading treatment or punishment. So who would like to have the first question on public order? Yes.
Hannah Russell from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. Just focusing in on the recommendation itself, which flags hate crime. It has come to our attention within the Commission that there is most likely an organised element to hate crime within certain areas, particularly of Belfast and possibly wider. I'm just wondering if this has come to the Policing Board's attention and if it has been considered in terms of the broader report.
Les, you want to respond?
I'll respond briefly, and then maybe John might want to come in on this. Yes is the short answer. It's crystallised, particularly in the recent time. much of our discussion with PSNI has been about, and this has been a perennial problem, about where does the responsibility lay, for example, for dealing immediately. It used to be an issue about flags, it's now become an issue about kind of posters and various other things. It's fair to say within the board, even where you might have an ambiguity about whether actually it's the responsibility of the Department for Infrastructure or the Housing Executive, that actually police have a role, whether it's to take responsibility or to facilitate others to take responsibility. We haven't reached a kind of, but that's been a kind of an ongoing discussion around the most kind of recent. I'll maybe let John pick up the kind of wider kind of hate crime stuff that's in the report.
Yeah, no, I think that it is an important issue, and I think it's something that we will need to focus on in the future, because some of this, as everybody here knows, some of it was, I remember the first policy that I saw, I think it was on the 11th or 12th of July, about, posters and, on all kinds of issues, and the PSNI was very reluctant to take any action. That's the truth. I read their internal policy. It was, I thought, hopeless. It didn't describe the law correctly, and other people have seen this, but I think the world has changed a little bit. And now they, I won't mention names, but new lawyers have looked at this, and I think they've come up with a better approach to how what the real issues are, and that's beginning to filter through to PSNI. That's not to say it's working, and I watched a Spotlight program about the nature of who is responsible and what do you do when somebody is subject to some kind of hate crime, and do you give them, what kind of advice do you give them, or do you see them as a victim of crime and then consider the perpetrator? So I think the PSNI is on a movement towards something better. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to be continuing to push them. And in fact, at the Performance Committee, I think only last time, which was a couple of weeks ago, this was a key question for the senior officers that came to see, came to talk about some of these things, and we requested that they produce some more detailed policy, and that was and that's produced to the Performance Committee, and presumably the Performance Committee will want to see that published. So I think there's a journey, but it's unfortunate that we're starting at this point.
Hey, sorry, Megan. Geraldine Hanna, Victims of Crime Commissioner Designate. It really links to the previous point, and it's maybe a suggestion for the board. The issue that I think was it Hannah highlighted from the Human Rights Commission is an issue that is raised by victims quite regularly as well, and I think that there's something here about the data and what is the evidence here, and with relation to the two links, the hate crime itself, but also the paramilitarism link, and whether that's a perception, whether that's justified, whether that's that the victim themselves may believe it may be, but actually police may know that there possibly isn't substance there. And I think there's something about more that we could do with relation to the analysis and the intelligence around this, which can help reassure some people, but also help give us a really true picture of what is happening across Northern Ireland, but particularly within some of the areas in Belfast as well, where this does seem to be a perception amongst community groups and victims themselves.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Ryan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Hannah, for the question. I mean, and just to reassure you, it definitely has been something that the board have focused on with us. And my colleague, ACC Bobby Singleton, sort of led on this work for us, supported by a dedicated hate crime team. And you'll have heard Bobby speak, firstly to say that it's very much a kind of case-by-case basis when, depending on what the article or item might be or where it might be. And you'll have heard Bobby also talk about that in some cases these things are not organised by paramilitary groups, but maybe that some of those that are putting posters or flags up, are part of them, and others, from the community. Whichever way we know, we're front and centre in terms of the all eyes look to policing, try and support people who are feeling victimised and abused by this, and we don't want to be found wanting in relation to it. And that's very much Bobby's approach has been try and get us on the front foot of this as much as we can with good legal advice as to how we go about it. I think we all recognise in this room that we all, in terms of the public service, public sector, have a role to play in this, as do communities within it. But I think we all also acknowledge that it should have no place here in Northern Ireland, and that we all need to be really positive, proactive in terms of how we're able to respond to it.
Sinead?
Just to add to Jerry's suggestion, I mean, obviously we're here today around sort of a human rights theme. Another important piece of work for the board is the policing plan and the monitoring of performance against the policing plan. As you know, Jerry, there's a large strand there around victims of crime. One of the things that we're hoping to do this year and in the rest of this financial year and beyond is to get some what we're calling conversations with a purpose going around some of those strands that are in the policing plan, so that before we have conversations with Ryan and other senior officers through our committees, that we're having, a month or two in advance, a conversation with the likes of yourselves, Human Rights Commission, others, to maybe unpack some of these issues that you're talking about, so we then can go in and have a really good, constructive but robust conversation with senior officers informed by that dialogue. So just to highlight, hopefully there's a strand of work we will take forward in the next 12 months, which will supplement the human rights work and should hopefully help. So,
Thanks, Sinead. I'm going to move on to use of force. And within the report in particular, issues around spit and bite guards and tasers have been highlighted. So who would like to have a first question in relation to use of force? Yes?
Who is it, sorry? Oh, sorry.
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 I'm bypassing the rule that I'm only allowed to speak once. I just want to reflect the recent use of force stats from a couple of weeks ago imply that there is and I'm from the Children's Law Centre, so focusing on children, young people for a second, imply that there are fewer young people who have been subject to force compared to the previous year. And on the face of it, that's obviously something we would welcome, but when you look at the figures, it suggests that there is not really a decline in the instances of force, which would imply that a fewer number of young people are having a more aggressive or forceful interaction with the officers, with the police, which I would note a concern about and would welcome observations as to, for many of the dip sampling of records and body-worn footage and so on, why you think that is. I would also want to express a really clear concern about the continued use of spit hoods on under 18s. Particularly, the figures only give the column is 12 and under, so we don't know what age the child was. But on someone of that age, I find it difficult, if not impossible, to think of a situation when it would be appropriate to put a spit hood on someone of that age, of a child of that age. And another issue linked to this section, but not solely, is not necessarily just for the policing board and for the PSNI to comment on, but what we're observing of the PSNI being listed on care plans of children in care, and it feeds into the comment that's been made throughout this report and others about who's the right person to respond, and the PSNI being placed in a situation when they are not the right people to respond, and just to kind of note a concern about that today as well.
Thanks, Fergal. Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, and all very, I think, important observations. So just for the wider room in terms of the use of spit and bite guards, there are internal processes to check the use of them, so to review the usage, to look at body-worn video footage and to understand was the usage appropriate of those, which I think is a really kind of helpful bit of everyday business as usual for policing now, to make sure that the spit and bite guard is being appropriately used. I, like you know, the idea of a young person in a spit and bite guard is a really difficult thing. I don't want to see young people kind of traumatized, and no doubt the use of the spit and bite guard does that. Of course, the use of the spit and bite guard should be used in the extreme and in the horrible situation of being spat upon. I think everybody acknowledges that to be a horrible thing to happen for anybody. but it's right that the focus is on there. I, like you, think it's really important that we understand if there are certain young people who are more and more being subject to the police having to take them into custody, used force when the young person is in such a state of high anxiety, aggression, vulnerability, and then the police are going to deal with them. I know of certainly one example where we've gone repeatedly to deal with a young girl when she's in such a high state of anxiety that there's almost an inevitability that the police will have to use force to some extent in terms of trying to deal with that young person to get them to a place of safety. I let you ask the question, is that right? Just the sheer dynamic of policing being involved in that situation, but I know that one that we're being called almost as the last resort in relation to it. So I think working with our partners in health, and we work through the community support hubs and other avenues, try and look at that data to see how that young person, how we can collectively not put them in a position, or the police in a position where that's happening again and again. So I think your point's absolutely on the money around that we need to understand collectively that much better in relation to those young people. Absolutely.
Yes.
Briefly, I mean, there are a couple of issues I think here. I mean, it was used once in 2023-24 on somebody under 12 and 11 times on someone 13 to 17. The overall use of spit and bite guards is going up on adults, but there was always that it would be an absolute last resort to be used on a child or a young person. It's fair to say this is one of those areas where deploying spit and bite guards is not a matter that we can intervene on in terms of that's an operational issue for a chief constable. It was made by the previous chief constable. What we can do is get the information, interrogate it, and ask PSNI. In the performance committee this year, we actually ourselves looked at one example of its use on a child. I think it was, people were taken aback at kind of, and actually we were as much taken aback about what actually was a set of social work issues were simply calling in PSNI, in actually what should be dealt with as social work issues. So there's kind of a set of issues there. John gets to see, if he wishes to see, the application of some of the spit and bite guards. So that's our role, and in the same way as strip searching of children is not dropping off our agenda, this issue isn't either. But it's fair to say again that there were pressures, particularly around police on the ground, and the number of assaults of police officers, and disproportionately in Northern Ireland, we can't get to the bottom of this, you're much more likely to be attacked as a police officer in Northern Ireland, not by children, young people, but generally, and assaulted, than you are anywhere else in the UK. So there's a set of kind of issues that we're grappling with there as well, but this hasn't gone off our agenda.
I know Patrick wants to come in, but just, has anyone else got a question on this before I give Patrick? Patrick.
Thank you again. Patrick Corrigan from Amnesty International. I want to echo Fergal's concerns, in particular of the use of spit hoods on children. I'm going to just speak more generally, though, around use of force. I mean, the report that Fergal referred to that just came out a couple of weeks ago on use of force by the PSNI over the previous 12 months showed a 21% increase in the number of incidents where the police used force, up to 21,500 times in the previous 12 months. And of those, 6% of use of force incidents were on people from ethnic minority communities, despite the recent the census showing that they made up just 3.4% of the population. And the figures were even more stark in terms of Irish travellers, with 8% of use of batons and 5% of the use of police dogs were on Irish travellers, despite them making up just 0.14% of the population. And I think, I mean, it came up in terms of, I think it was the use of stop and search earlier around the apparent disproportionate use of those powers against Irish travellers. I think, again, it demands further interrogation and demands answers.
Ryan, the disreported use of force on minorities?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we probably touched on this earlier in terms of, as you've quite rightly said, it's understanding the data, again, around use of force, the checks and balances in place in terms of reporting that when it is used. I think Les has commented already, you are more likely to be assaulted if you're a police officer here than you are elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We need to understand that as well, to add into the mix of all of this. But again, absolutely open to conversations, understanding challenge around if there is disproportionality, what might be causing it, and there could be a range of issues, but the starting point is going to be the data to help us to interrogate that, and that works ongoing.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to move on to legacy. Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights places a duty to investigate a death, and Article 13, the right to an effective remedy. In 2014, outstanding troubles cases were passed to the PSNI Legacy and Disclosure Branch. There's some 1,100 cases involving 1,400 deaths, and they were addressed through a case sequencing model, which is obviously a very slow process. We now have the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, and the work previously undertaken by the PSNI those cases will be passed over to the ICRIR. Does anyone have a question on legacy? Ryan, perhaps I could ask just in relation to the current position and the transition from PSNI to ICRIR and how you're handling that.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Probably just worth highlighting what the impact of the Act was on PSNI at the start of April. So, as Brendan's indicated, there were in the region of about 1,200 troubles-related murders that sat within Legacy Investigation Branch, and as of the 1st of April, we had to stop work on those overnight in the vast majority of those cases, and that's tough, obviously, for colleagues who were working with families and investigating those cases. So that work has come to an end. They don't automatically pass, Brendan, across to the new body. It is the families would trigger that with the new body, so it's not that we have passed all of that work to them at this point. The new body requires families to ask them to do some work, and then that process would begin. We have about 200 cases that will remain on the PSNI's workload that fell outside the window of the Act, and we will start to work our way through those. In terms of the inquest side of things, the 5-year inquest plan that had previously been agreed, again, that came to an end. So the work in relation to those inquests that didn't reach the verdict stage came to an end as well. So the ICRIR is just really in the throes of becoming set up. I'm cautious of speaking too much on their behalf because they are an independent body, but I think it's probably helpful to illustrate where that work is at the moment. The volume of demand is unknown, clearly. You will know better than I that in terms of the confidence in those coming forward to approach the body for work, there's been a lot of public commentary around that. So I think the volume of demand is unknown. I kind of want to reiterate what I and the Chief Constable have said previously, that anything that the new body ask of the Police Service of Northern Ireland in terms of passing of information to them in relation to cases that they are bringing forward for investigation, they will get, and they will get in the unredacted form. The legislation is clear that the previous requirement of PSNI to run a number of lenses across information in terms of risk to life and the information that was contained within it, national security considerations and others, that passes from the PSNI over to the new body. In effect, we will pass that information through to them in an unrestricted way for them to work with. I would just want to give that reassurance that we are absolutely committed to doing that. We have set up an information hub within PSNI that will take requests through from the new body and then pass that information through to them. At this point, they're very much in the setup and working through the operational workings of how this will work when they start to get requests through from families, etc. So I anticipate it will be another few months before we start working through that process, but we're working really actively with them to make sure that works smoothly.
Thanks, Ryan, for that update. I'm going to move on to privacy. And as we'll all be very much aware, August last year, we had the major data breach within the PSNI, which placed officers and staff in danger. So really brought home the whole challenges around protecting an individual's privacy. And then in a wider sphere, the impact of technological developments on privacy and the new capabilities, meaning that privacy rights are open to new pressures, and yet what's the control framework around that? So last year, the Policing Board published a report on privacy and policing with a view to starting a conversation around transparency and the controls required in this new era. So does anyone have a question on privacy? Ryan, just to continue to give you a hard time here. Out of interest, are the PSNI using any new technologies to assist in how they do business? Either AI, facial recognition, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually quite useful to start to talk about the different types of technology. So I think you start at the bottom, platform digitization. So what are we digitizing to make us able to use our data better? From that digitization, what can we automate? So automation to then allow some of those processes to happen more quickly and more effectively. And then and where does AI or machine learning start to do some of that work for us? And then to start making some, if it can do in the right framework, some decisions around that. Before you get into even some of the more specialist and niche investigative capabilities, but broadly our focus in policing in terms of the use of technology, digitization, automation and AI is in the space of doing its inefficiency and effectiveness. So it's trying to do business processes much more quickly than we can, because we all know in terms of the financial situation facing PSNI, we've got the lowest number of officers and staff since PSNI came into existence. So actually technology developments for us are very much in the high volume, low risk processes. So a few examples of that, and they're maybe not as kind of fun maybe as some of the investigative things that people might want to talk about, but it's things such as talk to text technology to speed up our ability to take statements and to transcribe interviews when we couldn't do that as quickly as before. We are doing some proof of concept technology around the use of automatic or fingerprint scanning out of stations, just to help that process a little more quickly. We're running some kind of robotic process work within our firearms licensing in terms of processing applications. So it's very much in that space of where we have people doing processes that could be done more quickly to free up their time to focus on quality is in the main. We recognise, of course, in the investigative space that it's probably the most controversial in terms of privacy. Understanding that criminals are moving at an unfettered pace around the use of technology to enable their what they do in terms of crime, proceeds of crime globally. So they're fast-paced and they are effective in the use of that. So to an extent, we're always playing catch-up, but that's understandable because they're the ethical, legal and financial constraints and what we're able to do around that. facial recognition technology, for example, is probably one of those things that you will have seen, because in England and Wales you have 44 police forces, and whilst they'll work under National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing guidance around this, some are moving at different paces, and others you may have seen the Metropolitan Police, for example, have been using some lifetime facial recognition work. We have got an internal facial recognition board to try and manage our approach to this, which at present is, we're very minimal in terms of our thoughts around it. John has a seat on that board to help steer us in relation to it. So I think the message is we're very cautious about it because of all of those things I've outlined in terms of the kind of implications for it, in terms of the ethics and privacy, etc. But for us, a lot of our technology work is actually around, can we do some of our processes more quickly than others?
Patrick? Yes.
Thank you, Patrick Corrigan, Amnesty International. Obviously, we have been long concerned about the arrest operation against journalists Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey back in 2018 that resulted in significant damages, compensation being paid to them, and a process which is now playing out in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in London. The police conducted an internal review, or commissioned a KC to conduct an internal review of that botched operation that cost so much public money as well as reputation to the police. We asked for that to be published and we were refused. Instead, the Chief Constable said that they were working on a summary document and that would be published. And I understand even the Policing Board hasn't been provided with a copy either of the overall review report nor any summary, and we're still waiting many months on for that summary document. When are we either going to see the full review report or the summary document? And indeed, when is the Policing Board going to see it?
Ryan, are you in a position to respond?
Sorry, Peter, I can't give you anything firm on that, but the Chief Constable is really clear in his commitments around publication. He's also brought into the KC Angus McCulloch to do some review work into this as well, which the board are well cited upon that as it develops. So I can't give you an exact date today, but I know the Chief Constable's made very public commitments as to how he's intending to approach this, because we understand that it is a really important issue of transparency.
John?
So the Policing Board was shown a copy of the review. It does not have a copy of the review. I was shown a copy of the review, and I have a copy of the review. And I've no idea when there's going to be a summary.
Yeah, I have neither a copy of the review nor have I seen a summary, and I'm pretty sure so that's one I'll take away and will raise, and whether it's caught up in the undertow of the IPT or not, but that's not been given to date as a reason, and I think it's actually separate from that. So that's one as a takeaway for us. But I wanted to just quickly come back to the privacy issue very briefly, but there's a takeaway from us to you on this one. My experience of the technological developments is they're not being driven primarily by PSNI. A lot of the facial recognition and the assessment you got from Ryan, I think, is completely accurate, that there's work being done here to see what's happening elsewhere. It's being driven by the Home Office, it's being driven by the College of Police, and it's very likely that there will be a UK-wide approach to these things. And I would encourage you to read the privacy report, because the one thing we know is if there's a worry that kind of criminals are outpacing authorities about technology, police and the use of AI and other things will weigh, and those developments will outpace accountability and oversight and general public's understanding of what of their data and their how much they're under kind of general surveillance, and the extent of which that's done. So is to focus on this issue as something that you keep bringing back to the board. We've got a structure in that privacy report to develop something that actually does look at accountability, etc. We're moving, but it's moving at a fairly glacial pace, And this is one area where I think we're asking you to put some pressure on us to keep that in. It's one of those issues that gets completely forgotten about until something happens. And we want to try and do something in the policing board about preparing rather than wait until after the event.
To add to what Liza said, I mean, I think rather than putting it on yourselves, I mean, I know the intention is, I'm looking at Adrian, we will be hosting a round table at some point soon. I mean, as has been said, this is an area where there's rapid developments, and an area that we therefore as a board will want to keep a close eye along with the other issues that we've talked about today to ensure that privacy rights are fiercely protected. I think, you know, obviously the human rights obligations on services across the UK are the same. I suppose for us as a board, we're acutely conscious just how impactful stuff like this can be on public confidence in policing in Northern Ireland, maybe more so than in other places. So I think that round table, Brendan, will be a good opportunity for us to continue this conversation.
And we're going to take a final question on privacy.
Hi, thanks very much. Claire McCann from the Human Rights Commission. Again, thank you for allowing me to contribute. I was just interested, Sinead, your final comment there was that the rules around this are the same across the UK. We've identified data protection and privacy as one of those areas that fall within scope of these new protections pursuant to Brexit and the Windsor Framework. So actually, I think there's going to be a difference between how Northern Ireland engages with this going forward and how it's going to apply across the rest of the UK. So I just wanted to flag that up, and obviously we're in the Human Rights Commission are still in the foothills of what this means for us. We're still working out what it means. But we're very willing to engage and have useful conversations about what this means for our work going forward.
Or someone on behalf of the Commission, Hannah?
Okay, thank you. Final theme is levers of change. This is a new theme in the human rights reports, and it attempts to be reflective and understand processes and procedures which promote a human rights-based approach to policing. Now, this final session I'm going to do slightly differently. So in terms of being reflective, I'm first of all going to invite each member of the panel to be reflective, and having carried out this 5-year review, what's your one key takeaway to share with us? And then I'm going to open it up to the floor and give the same offer to members of the audience in terms of what's your one key piece of advice to the policing board in response to this 5-year review of human rights. So in terms of the panel, we'll start with John.
This is a surprise. Thank you very much. Well, I think that the policing board is an accountability body, and although obviously the Human Rights Act is law, and the PSNI are bound to comply with it, when it comes to things, for instance, that we've talked about already in relation to the spit and bite guards, for instance, there is the extent to which the board was successful wasn't because they could stop it happening or ban it, but to try to put in place a series of protections and criteria by which it was used. Now, you can take a different view. You can take different views about the extent to which that was successful. But just as a note, that was the one report that was signed by me, not by the policing board. Draw your own conclusions about that. So I think that, you know, in a sense, we are trying to ensure the protection of human rights by processes, by safeguards, by policies and service instructions and reporting. And so in relation to take that continued example, and then I'll stop there, is that, you know, the presumption is now that it shouldn't be used against children and young people. Now, whether you think that goes far enough, but that wasn't the position that existed before. So that the success of the policing board, given the operational independence of the PSNI, maybe that's as far as we can go.
Hi, Patrick. I suppose for me, I think learning points and things that I would want to see continue are these sorts of conversations actually, because I mean, I feel really old. I remember working with Keir Starmer and Jean Gordon on the very early versions of what we were doing around human rights. And whilst what was done then was really good, I think the whole way in which we do business, and indeed policing, it does businesses a lot more open and transparent. And I mean, as has been shown today, I mean, obviously the work that John has done, he's got a certain amount of time to cover a range of issues. Conversations like this tell us what's important to the community. And I think we've identified 2 or 3 things today that will help shape what we do going forward. So that sort of two-way engagement to me is important.
Thanks, Sinead. Ryan?
Yeah, and John makes a good point around the importance of policy and process around this. But so I came to PSNI about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, having spent 10 years working elsewhere. And I have, every day since I have come into the PSNI, been incredibly proud of as an organisation of how human rights does sit at the heart of decision making in a way that I hadn't seen in policing elsewhere. We should be the advocates and the protectors of people's rights. So that's about our kind of spirit and our values and what we're about here in policing in Northern Ireland. And I actually think the opportunity to celebrate that is really important, because in doing that, that is what our frontline officers and staff see has value, and they want to celebrate it as well, and therefore they want to live it and breathe it, as opposed to being seen as something that is a stick to beat them with. Actually, it is something that their job is to celebrate, to protect, and to be seen as the advocates for it, particularly for victims. So I think there's something for me just around the kind of values and leadership bit of this, because human rights isn't procedural. It isn't about policy. All of that's really important in enabling some of it, but the key lever for me is people's commitment to it, the people that we bring into the job, and that they live and breathe it and they're proud of it. I certainly am, because I think the Police Service of Northern Ireland puts it at the forefront of what we do. We open ourselves to criticism, scrutiny, transparency around it, which is absolutely right, and that drives change. The work around the the strip search of young people, for example, I think we see real tangible change there because of that collaborative partnership work to it. We invest in having human rights advisors where other police services don't. And we bring people into the hotbed and the heart of our decision making on very difficult days, dealing with very difficult decisions, to expose that so you can see the anatomy of that decision making and where human rights is the heart of it. So for me, it's about just how it's right absolutely in all of our values.
Thanks, Ryan. And Les?
Yeah, my plea really is to follow Sinead, to work with us from whatever perspective you come from. There are constraints on what we can do in the policing board, statutory, procedural, resources sometimes, and political. But there are things that we can do that you can't, and there are vice versa. So the strip searching is a good example. The ending of routine reporting of minority ethnic individuals who might be the victims or witnesses or even alleged perpetrators of crime to the Home Office. There are examples of where we've worked together. You can be our eyes and ears as well. So where there are things happening, bring them to us. And there is no other police service, I think, that takes human rights as seriously. That doesn't mean to say there are not issues sometimes to do with inertia and other reasons that PSNI can't do a great deal more, but there is an openness to have a dialogue and a debate about human rights. And having John Wadham, and there is no equivalent of John in any police force in these islands, is actually makes an enormous amount of difference. John gets into places where nobody on the policing board and elsewhere can get to. So that is a resource that's worth cherishing for another year and hopefully beyond.
Thanks, Les. And now open to the floor for anyone that would like to, having read the 5-year review, give the policing board some advice going forward.
I guess just to respond in the same spirit that you've addressed us, that we're here because we want to work with you and we want the policing board to succeed in its role, and that we're here, yes, to maybe ask slightly annoying questions around sometimes, but actually it's because we want the police force, if you've just described, transparent, accountable and effective, that has the trust of the communities that it serves, and that's why we're here, and we will continue to work with all of our partners to do that.
Hi, Paula Rogers from Include Youth, working with care experienced young people. Just to say, keep up the communication with the young people who experience policing in a really negative way. John came and spoke to probably about 20 young people in our offices at Include Youth. He was welcomed. It was a good debate. I think John probably got a lot from it as well. So it was just say, keep that communication up. And as Virgil said, the messages may not always be easy to hear, and they may be the same things that you'll hear a lot, but you've got to keep talking directly to those young people, particularly from that care background.
Thank you. I'm Justin Kwame from the Migrant Center, and I think beside commitment, I think they should, PSNI especially, should have like a culture change as well, because despite having all those human rights instruments, if there's no cultural change to be able to apply this thing, we'll still have problem around, hate crime, because sometimes when it comes to this situation, police officers think about self-protection first before engaging with the minoritized community as well. That's very important. And my advice, in terms of the policing board, I think there's a need for diversification within the policing board now, because the community is changing. So it's like, and the minoritized community in Northern Ireland is changing now. It's not, used to be like Chinese and Asian and Polish, but, now you have growing population of different community present as well. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think Jerry has a point to make.
Thanks. It kind of just builds on a lot of what's been said. I think we are in a unique position, obviously, in Northern Ireland in terms of the accountability of the police and the role that the policing board play, and I think that's really positive. I think what you see threaded through that report is evidence of the good work that has been done in terms of engagement, and I would particularly note the work around data sharing of migrant victims, and welcome the policing board's interest in that area. John and Les's work in particular in engaging with the voluntary sector, who had very legitimate concerns, and ultimately at the end of the day the police's later response to that and engagement, I think, is really shown benefits, and it's about building on that work. And I think what's clear from this room is you have a very engaged sector as well, particularly a very engaged community and voluntary sector who's willing to share experiences with the aim of improving society for all of us. And I think when we're all pushing the one direction on this, everyone wants the police service and the society, which Ryan, you have eloquently outlined. So I think keep up the good work. I am really pleased to see victims in that report and being referenced, and particularly their human rights as well, which I think sometimes in the arena some people maybe forget that they have them too. But well done, and I look forward to reading through the 296-page document at my leisure. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry. It's not a good read, I have to say. Yes, it's not an easy read, but if you do suffer from insomnia, I'd recommend it. The 45-page document's much better. Are there any final comments from the floor? I'd just like to make some closing remarks then, really to some extent encompassing many of the points that have come across this afternoon. So the Police Act 2000 places a statutory duty on the policing board to monitor the performance of the police in complying with the Human Rights Act. And the board takes this responsibility very seriously, and in response has appointed a HR advisor, John Wadham, and this is unique, as Les has said, among oversight bodies across these islands. And the board has now taken time out to review progress over the past 5 years and has published this report. And The report highlights that in the annual and thematic reports, there have been 119 recommendations. 24 have been fully implemented, 71 are work in progress, and only 8 have been rejected. And those are doing the maths. There's a few that have fallen by the wayside because they've been overtaken by others. So the big question is, should we be satisfied? And of course, you can always do things better on a journey to excellence. But from my perspective, this report clearly shows a commitment by the PSNI to embracing a human rights approach to policing. And in terms of progress, I would highlight the enhanced governance around strip searching of young people in custody, where the numbers are now decreasing, and in all cases, an appropriate adult is always present. I would also highlight the focused strategies to tackle violence against women and girls, and the decrease in the number of repeat victims of crime. And most recently, the positive response from the police to address the genuine concerns from those with an unclear immigration status in terms of reporting crime. And perhaps finally, the investment in de-escalation training for officers to reduce the requirement for the use of force. So a lot of positives to take. But I think the report also provides learning for the policing board itself, particularly around the monitoring of the implementation of the recommendations. And I think we'll have to take some time to discuss and address this. So can we or could we move things forward quicker? Is 24 recommendations a year realistic to expect the police to implement? And I say that in the context of all the other oversight bodies that the police has to respond to, in terms of the Criminal Justice Inspectorate, His Majesty Inspectorate of Constabulary, the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and so the list goes on. So the PSNI have a table of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recommendations from all these oversight bodies to implement. So, and I'm struck in terms of particularly our work around human rights, between the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So efficiency is getting everything done, and effectiveness is doing the right things. So is it important to implement 119 recommendations, or actually what are the 10 that are key, and those are the ones that we need to see implemented? And that's something I think that the board will take away to ensure that we are actually, in our reports, being effective in moving the journey to excellence in human rights policing forward, and identifying those that are essential to implement and those that are nice to implement. So in closing, can I first of all thank John Wadham for all his work in pulling this report together. Can I also thank the other members of the panel, Les, Ryan, and Sinead. And can I thank the staff who have pulled this afternoon together, in particular Julie Patterson and Jill Hughes, and all the others involved in pulling the event together, and perhaps you could show your appreciation. And finally, can I thank all of you for your engagement this afternoon and your very insightful questions. Thank you.